the Bible Study Evangelista Show, Bible study spinach that tastes like cake. I'm Sonia Corbett, your Bible Study Evangelista, and we are in our Catholic Social Justice series. We have done the life and dignity of the human person, the call to family and community, rights and responsibilities, option for the poor and vulnerable, and today we're looking at the dignity of work and the rights of workers. And in the marketplace, where too often the quarterly bottom line takes precedent over the rights of workers, we believe as Catholics that the economy must serve people, not the other way around. So work is more than a way to just make a living. It's a form of continuing participation in God's creation. And if the dignity of work is going to be protected, then the rights of workers have to be protected. The right to productive work, to decent and fair wages, to organize and join unions, to private property, and economic initiative. Respecting these rights promotes an economy that promotes human life. It defends human rights, and it advances the well-being of everyone. And so that principle, in actually the last several of the 7 Catholic social justice principles, are sort of, you can combine them under the common good, which we'll do in the very last show, the wrap-up summary show. I'll show you those. They're actually 4 pillars that contain the 7 principles, and that's a little easier way to look at it, actually. But it's really important that the Church has broken it down into these 7 because it does highlight very important things in each one. And we're going to, as usual, we're going to take a little bit different tack than maybe one we continually see in the media all over the place right now when we talk about the dignity of work and the rights of workers. But for us as believers, that dignity of work comes out of the whole theology of creation. In Genesis, we see God made creation, and then he entrusted to us the continuation of his work. I talk about this quite a bit because this is a sort of a favorite principle or a favorite idea of mine from the scriptures. God is always working. And of course, he's always at rest simultaneously. But we see that in Genesis 1, that God creates, he works in 6 days, and then he rests on the 7th. And of course, that doesn't mean that he needed to rest. He did that for us. And because it is contained, this idea of work and rest is contained in those 10 commandments, then work is part of natural law, as is rest as well. But it's interesting to me, we have a work week of 5 days, and then typically you have Saturday and Sunday off. But the way the scriptures are laid out, you work for 6 days, and then you rest on the 7th. And of course, we do all work. Even if we have a 5-day work day, or a work week, we typically work on Saturday as well. And a lot of us work on Sundays. Shame, shame. And of course, I've talked about that quite a bit in previous series. Fulfilled, I talk about the liturgical year, which is based on that, the kernel of the Sunday. I'm digressing here, but it's an important point. And it actually begins, the whole Bible begins with the creation, and it ends with the new creation. And so God is always working, and our work continues the work of God through us. So Sabbath and work are not opposites, they're a whole. And depending on the jobs that we have, the work that we do, and when I say this, I'm actually talking about if we work in the home as our primary vocation, or if we have employment outside the home. Either way, the primary location for our spiritual formation is the workplace. And that's mostly because that's where we spend most of our time. And so the people that we work with and the people we work for, they contribute to our spiritual formation. I know that's the reason I like this idea, is because it helped me a lot understanding this understanding of work and the dignity of work and the dignity of the workplace and the dignity of colleagues is very helpful to me, and it should be helpful to each of us who has a difficult work situation. And that's what I'm really trying to do, is encourage you if you're in one of those situations. So really, our work then is a continuation of God's work. What is the Holy Spirit creating through us and through our work? And how is he ordering creation through us and through our work? And it's really that big an idea because Jesus himself embraced creation as his own workplace. And he had quite a bit to say about work, too. And we'll see in another segment here some of those parables that he taught about work. But work, then, is God's gift to us. It's part of natural law. It's part of man's dignity, and it's part of his duty. So whenever you see populations of people who do not work, then there is a lack of love and a lack of dignity on their part. And so it's important that we help everyone who is able to work, because we are supporting and we are affirming the dignity of the human person in providing workplaces that are just.
If you like having Bible study in your pocket and you have an iPhone or iPad, why not leave a review? Search Bible Study Evangelista in iTunes and tell everyone how you're loving and lifting all you've been given. Here's Sonia.
Let's get social. Connect with me at Bible Study Evangelista on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and now you can also find me on the #1 Catholic app for iPhone and Android, Laudate. Let's connect. And now, let's get some Bible study in your pocket. I want to read a quote by Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritate. It says, "I would like to remind everyone, especially governments engaged in boosting the world's economic and social assets, that the primary capital to be safeguarded and valued is man, the human person in his or her integrity. Man is the source, the focus, and the aim of all economic and social life." Boy, would our world not be a much better place if we kept this in mind. And I'm speaking directly now to those of you who own businesses or who employ people. Those people who work for you are the focus and the aim of your business. And if you saw it that way, rather than the bottom line, or the almighty dollar, as some people say, and I'm not accusing anybody. I'm not looking at anybody in my mind as I'm saying this. I'm just thinking very generally, if we kept that principle in mind, that we exist to help employ people and support them in their own lives and their own dignity, what a different place the world would be, would it not? And if we worked for people like that and companies like that. St. John Paul II said, "We inherit the work of the generations before us, and we share in the building of the future of all those who will come after us." All this should be kept in mind when considering the rights that come with work or the duty to work. So if we look in the Garden of Eden, we see that it is man's duty to work, and it's part of his dignity. And so we have to keep in mind through this principle that both things are true and both are important. It is dignity for man to work, and it is his duty. And of course, there are responsibilities on both sides. We talked about the rights and responsibilities last week. Now, part of what is so dignified about work is that we're able to use the different gifts that God has given us. And I want to read a little bit from the parable of the talents. And I'd like for you to keep in mind that, and I know you've probably heard this parable 100 times, but a talent, one single talent, this was a measure of money. And in biblical language, actually, a talent was not just the money, it was any sort of goods that were traded. So, but as a measure of money, let's just keep in mind that one talent was worth more than 16 years' wages. Years. So one talent was 16 years worth of wages. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's pretty long, and we know the story, but it says in Matthew 25, verse 14, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them." See, he's talking about goods there, not just money. "And to one he gave 5 talents, that would have been 80 years plus worth of money. Years' wages worth of money. So he gave one 5 talents, to another he gave 2, that would have been 32 years worth of wages, and to another he gave 1, that would have been 16 years' wages, to each according to his own ability." Okay, so that's an important point. To each according to his own ability. So God gives us different abilities. And so he gives us different responsibility, okay? And that's an obvious thing from this parable. But what's not so obvious is if we just change the wording around just a little bit. St. Jerome said that when God or Jesus, when he called the apostles, he gave them the gospel doctrine. To some he gave more, and others he gave less, and not because he was being stingy, but he was meeting the capacity of the one who was receiving the gift of the gospel. So in the 5 and the 2 and the 1 talents, we recognize the diversity of gifts wherewith we have been entrusted, St. Jerome says. And Origen agrees. He talks about the diversity of gifts when we're talking about the talents, and it is financial here in the parable, but we know also it's goods, and now we see from the fathers that it also includes gifts from God. St. Gregory said to hide one's talent in the earth is to devote the ability we have received to worldly business. So to him, earthliness then is when the unfaithful servant takes his talent and he hides it in the dirt and he buries it, then he is actually, according to St. Gregory, he's using his talents and his gifts for earthly ends and not spiritual ones. It's also important in verse 29 of that same parable in chapter 25, Jesus says, "For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." More on that when we get back.
You're listening to the Bible Study Evangelista Show, Bible study spirits that taste like cake.
Sonia created the Love the Word Bible study method just for you, based on Mary's personal practice and formulated for your personality and temperament. Get your Love the Word meditations every Monday morning by signing up at BibleStudyEvangelista.com. Now, here's Sonia.
In the parable of the talents, we see that a merchant distributes talents, Jesus says, to each according to his own ability, and then he goes on a journey. And when he comes back, he finds out that the one who received the 5 talents traded and made another 5, and the one who had received 2 made 2 more, and the one who received 1 hid his or buried it in the ground. And so we see that the one who buried his was the unprofitable servant, according to Jesus. But there are a couple of principles here that I want to point out when we're talking about the rights and the dignity of workers. St. Gregory says that this lesson from the gospel warns us to consider whether those who seem to have received more in this world than others shall not be more severely judged by the author of the world. The greater the gifts, the greater the reckoning for them. Therefore should every one be humble concerning his talents in proportion as he sees himself tied up with a greater responsibility. And another point that's important is that if we don't properly use our talents, then they're taken away and they're given to someone who is faithful. Now, I pray this a lot. I pray a lot for God to give me we'll just say talents because we're talking about this parable, that other people don't want and won't use. Just give them to me, Lord. Whatever those blessings are, whatever the talents, whatever the opportunities, if someone else won't use it, then give it to me. My hand is raised. I say that a lot. But I want to kind of just change it up a little bit. And instead of using the word talent, because we know that the term talent in biblical use means a financial measure, it means goods, gifts, and talents. And when I say talents in this context, I mean those things and those abilities that we have, whether they're natural. It also means spiritual gifts. And all of these things are gifts from God. The Bible says, "What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not?" St. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians 4:7. I love that. That was like a slap in the face. I remember one time I was reading that and I was like, okay, yes, Lord, you're right. What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? And here in Romans 12:6, it says, we have different gifts according to the grace given us. Now, I want to just, as I said, change it up a little bit. I want us to start looking at this with a particular word, privilege. You have privileges. They are gifts from God. Your personality, your temperament, your talents, your abilities, your financial situation, everything about what you are and have came from God. It is a gift from God. We're talking about gifts in this parable of the talents. Some of us have small gifts, which are actually still very large. That's the reason I wanted to explain the measure of one talent. The one guy who got one talent got 16 years worth of income. Okay, so it's still an enormous gift. But let's just think about all these privileges, right, that we all have. We all have privilege. I'm using this word on purpose because it is a huge controversial term. But look at it in this way. You have privileges. Everyone has privileges. Every single human being created has special privileges that other people don't have. Everybody. There are physical privileges, there are spiritual privileges, there are mental privileges, there are economic privileges, there are social privileges. Why does God give 1 to some people, 2 to others, and 5 to still other people? Why is it not equal? Well, that's a question you need to ask Him. And when we're looking at our society, why is it not equal? Well, it's not equal because God gives you privileges precisely in order that you use them on behalf of other people in order to make the world a better place. That's the reason He does what He does. St. Catherine of Siena said that God could have easily have made every single person have everything he needed for salvation, but instead it pleased God that we need one another. And that's why St. Paul talks about us as being members of a body. Now, I am talking about the church, but I'm also talking about society because we're talking about social justice. And social justice, it is a truth, it is an absolute truth that some people have greater privilege than others do. And when I say that, I'm not trying to be political. I'm just saying it's a reality. But the reason is it's not a bad thing necessarily. It's meant to be used for the common good, as are all gifts and all graces and all privileges and all resources. Everything is distributed unequally. And that was done purposely because God wants us to rely on one another and He wants us to rely on Him. So privilege then, not in the political way, but each of us has privileges in order to help make the world a better place. So there's a couple of words that get thrown around quite a bit when we're talking about privilege. Equality is one of them, where we treat all people equally. And then there's a new word that has cropped up, equity. And if you hear that, I'm going to be very general here because lots of people, just like privilege, use it in a whole lot of different ways. It has almost no meaning whatsoever because everybody means a different thing when they say it. But for the most part, all men are created equal, the Bill of Rights says. And so we treat each other equally. So equal, let's just use taxes as an example. If everyone was treated equally, then everyone would pay the same amount of tax. It would be a flat tax all the way across the board. Instead, there is equity in taxation. Some people are charged more because they make more, and other people are charged less because they make less. Some people don't pay taxes at all because they don't make enough. And that is an example of equity, where all people have access, and it's not equal all the way across the board because it takes into consideration special situations and special circumstances and the needs of of people. Well, it's supposed to. That's what equity is actually supposed to mean. I'm not saying that taxation is that way. I'm just giving you an example of the difference between equality and equity so we can kind of at least have a working idea of what it means in our heads. So politically speaking, what people say is that, yes, people are supposed to be treated equally, but not all people have equal access. And if we can also think about maybe the people who are disabled in this sort of way, where of course they have equal dignity, but they don't have equal access, let's just say to work, right? Everyone has a right to work, but not all people have the opportunity to work. And I mentioned my nephew Joshua a couple of weeks ago, and he's one of these people. He could work. He could hold a job. He could do bagging groceries or something along that line that would give him that sense of dignity that he deserves as a human person. But he doesn't have those opportunities. That's not necessarily because nobody would hire him, although there aren't very many places that would. That's one of the really good things, I think, about Goodwill, because they do hire disabled people and give them an opportunity to experience the dignity of work. And his is a whole different example for a lot of other reasons. But my point is then that although every single person has equal dignity, every single one doesn't always have equal opportunity, or equal access, we could say. And so that's a little explanation of equality and equity. And I realize that is a very simplistic way of putting it, but do some more research if you're interested in that. So I want to also point out that God is equitable, though, in this parable as well. He's equitable in the parable of the talents because he gives, it's not equal. They don't all get the same amount. They are all distributed talents according to their ability, and they each have different abilities, right? So even the abilities themselves are equitable. They're not equal. And the talents then correspond to their ability. And so that the talents are also equitable, we could say. Now, in the parable of the vineyard, the landowner goes out and he hires laborers for his vineyard, and then he agrees with them for how much the daily wage is going to be, and he sends them into the vineyard to work. And so they go out about 9 o'clock, or he did. He goes out about 9 o'clock and he sees that there are people in the marketplace standing idle. And he said, go work in my vineyard and I'll pay you what's fair. And so they go off, and then he goes back around noon, and then at 3, and he does the same thing. He goes back about 5 o'clock, which is the end of the workday, and he still sees other people standing idle, and he asks them why, and they say, because nobody has hired us. Now notice this. He asks them why they are idle, and they say, because no one has hired us. And then he says, you two go to my vineyard, and then he pays them all the same wage. Now, why in the world would Jesus do that? Why would he continue to go back to the marketplace and find people who had not been working, hire them, and then pay them all the same wage after they worked an unequal amount of time? We'll talk about that when we get back.
You're listening to the Bible Study Evangelista Show, Bible study spirits that taste like cake.
Did you know you can get Bible Study Evangelista radio notes and podcasts delivered to your inbox every Monday morning? Redeem your Mondays. Join thousands of your fellow listeners by subscribing at BibleStudyEvangelista.com. Now, here's Sonia.
In the parable of the vineyard, Jesus tells the story of a landowner who hires workers throughout the day to work in his vineyard. And he goes out at daybreak, which would have been the time when they begin work. He goes out at 9, he goes out at noon, he goes out at 3, and then at 5 o'clock, long really after our typical work day, he continues to hire people who are standing idle. And he pays them all the same amount, whether they worked all day or whether they didn't really work at all. If they got hired at 5 o'clock, that's quitting time, right? So why did he do that? The key there is in the question, why do you stand here idle all day? And they said, because no one has hired us. They went to the marketplace looking for work. That's what you did. You went to the marketplace to find work for the day. And the people who needed workers would go to the marketplace and they would pair up and they would pay people to come work for them. They went to look for work and they were never hired. And so the landowner hires them and he pays them the same wage as those who had gotten there early and worked all day. Now, we don't know why they came late. It could have been they were lazy, but I don't think so. I think that there could have been a situation where they maybe had worked part of the day already and then came looking for more work. It could have been that the particular work that they were able to do was not available that day. It could have been a lot of things, but the point is they were there to work and they didn't have work. And so the landowner hires them anyway and pays them anyway. And so what's the principle here? Well, first of all, this is not equality, this is equity. The landowner does not hire them all at the same time and pay them all the same wage. And in fact, when you first read this parable, it's a little bit irritating if you're just like a normal person, right? Because if you're the one who got there early and you've been working all day long and some upstart shows up at 5 o'clock and he gets hired anyway and he gets the full day's wage, you're going to be irritable. And I would totally feel like that was unfair. And yet he said to them, friend, I'm not cheating you. Did I not agree with you for the usual day's wage? Take what's yours and go. What if I wish to give this last one the same as you? And basically he says, it's none of your business what I pay. You and I agreed on something and I gave you what we agreed on. So don't criticize me for being generous. Now, my point in telling you this story, first of all, is the fact that this is an example of equity rather than equality. I'm not advocating over one or the other. I'm just saying that when we're talking about the dignity of workers, this is what the landowner in this parable had in mind. He understood the dignity of work, and these workers had no work to do. And so they were idle all day long. And in compassion for them, he paid them anyway because they wanted to work. Now, Jesus tells this parable as an example of the kingdom of heaven, but we can also use this passage to kind of help us reflect on the relationship between work and sufficient wages and human dignity. And we have to look also at why does every person have a right to decent work? Because that's part of what this parable sort of upholds. Work is dignified. It is a duty because it is part of what makes us human. It is part of the dignity of being human, is being able to work, being able to create something, being able to contribute, being able to make a living, and being able to use our goods and our talents and our abilities to do something productive for ourselves, our families, our community, and our whole world. John Paul II said, the obligation to earn one's bread by the sweat of one's brow also presumes the right to do so. A society in which this right is systematically denied, in which economic policies do not allow workers to reach satisfactory levels of employment, cannot be justified from an ethical point of view, nor can that society attain social peace. Now, I want to warn you, because when we read these kinds of letters and encyclicals and documents from the church, we automatically read them with an American lens. But don't do that, because the Pope's right and are thinking constantly about the global church. So societies in which the right to work is systematically denied, where would that be? That would be in places where famine have wrecked an economy and the people, and governments who receive aid from other countries like ours possibly, and then they squander it. They they line their pockets rather than helping the people. That would be an example of a society in which the right to work is systematically denied. A society in which economic policies do not allow workers to reach satisfactory levels of employment. That's where employment levels are depressed or suppressed, and oftentimes those are because of bad economic policies, or it could be that there is corruption in the government that causes that as well. I realize that this stuff is mostly above our pay grade, right? Because we're not responsible for the entire country or the entire world, but it's important to keep this stuff in mind when we are consumers, which I'll get to in the last segment. But here's another quote by Pope Benedict XVI. In many cases, poverty results from a violation of the dignity of human work, either because work opportunities are limited through unemployment or underemployment, or because a low value is put on work and the rights that flow from it, especially the right to a just wage and to the personal security of the worker and his or her family. And what pops into my mind right there is widespread welfare. When that happens, a low value is put on work and the rights and the dignity that flow from work. And so in those situations, you have poverty. And then you have all of the other things that flow from poverty, the social issues, the health issues, the economic issues, the crime issues, the educational issues. Poverty causes a whole lot of problems in society because the church recognizes that everyone is made in God's image and likeness and therefore has inherent dignity. We also recognize that work exists for people, not people for work. People do not exist for work. So recognizing the rights of workers is one of the ways we honor the dignity of every person. And the Bible says in Isaiah that to observe religious practices but oppress your workers is false worship. So that's something we need to keep in mind if we employ people. Do we care about the person more than the job they do for us? Do we make sure that we pay them fairly? Do we make sure they have plenty of time off? Do we make sure that they have access to benefits if they work for us in a company or a situation in which it's big enough that they should be provided? Among the things that we have to uphold are the just wage, the safe working environment, and the possibility for the worker to participate in the fruits of his labor. Profit sharing is an obvious example there. So Catholic teaching upholds that workers have the right to dignified work as well as time for leisure and rest. And so that's obviously, we spoke about in the very first segment, that's part of natural law, how rest and work must go together. So people who work for us, or we as workers, we should have time for leisure and rest. We have the right to benefits such as sick leave and maternity and paternity leave, health care. Whether or not that's the responsibility of an employer, that's up for debate, but they should be available. Workers have the right to adequate support in their retirement. Whether or not the government should supply that is another topic for debate, because the principle of subsidiarity says that the lowest possible entity that can take care of an issue should. So should the government, who has a history of squandering our Social Security, should they be responsible for taking care of everyone's retirement? I don't know. I'm not saying they should or shouldn't. I'm just asking the question. And we also have to keep in mind that workers have the right to choose and form unions if that's what they want to do, and workers' associations, that kind of thing. This principle holds that workers have responsibilities. That comes under our rights and responsibilities principle, to provide a fair day's work for a fair day's wage. Now, I just going to have to take a little digression here and say that there is something very, very wrong in our society right now, because most people won't work. They have no work ethic. They go to work and they look at their phones all day, or they whine and they won't actually do the job. I mean, I have seen this all over the country. I've seen it all over the world. I actually was talking while I was in Poland with one of the gentlemen. I stayed with he and his wife, and we were talking about workers, and he was complaining about it. He was saying the same thing, that it's rampant everywhere. I don't know if this is a generational thing, and if it is, then it's our fault. We've raised our kids this way. people just don't have the work ethic that they used to have. And part of that is a rights and responsibilities thing. We all have rights, but very few people are expected to be responsible. And this is the same kind of principle. Yes, workers have rights, but they also have a responsibility to work a fair day's work for a fair day's wage. Now that principle, the parable of the vineyard, that was not an example of workers who wouldn't work. They were there to work. They just couldn't find work. And so the landowner paid them anyway. That was an example of charity on the landowner's part. But each of us workers has a responsibility to put in a fair day's work. That's part of why when I am invited to a speaking engagement for a conference or a retreat or whatever, while I'm there, I am completely at the group's disposal the entire time, unless I'm in the hotel room. And I try to stay available for the entire time because that's what I'm there for. I'm there to give myself on behalf of the planners, but also the group for whom they planned. I consider that my duty and my responsibility to the group, to the planners, but more than that, to God Himself.
You're listening to the Bible Study Evangelista Show, Bible study spinach that tastes like cake.
If you love having Bible study in your pocket, you can become a friend of the show. Click on the yellow Friend of the Show button on BibleStudyEvangelista.com and become a supporter of any amount and any frequency. Now, here's Sonia.
Managers, supervisors, and employers can make decisions in their workplaces that uphold the rights of workers. And if they can't make the decision, they can at least advocate for the rights of workers. And the Bible actually says in several places that if you don't work, you don't eat. Now, it's not speaking of the disabled, of the ill, of the infirm, of the elderly. It's not talking about that kind of situation. It's talking about able-bodied people who can work but won't work. And the Bible is clear that if you don't work, or we should say if you won't work, then you should not eat. So we have to be careful. Here's another place where these principles are so hard to keep in balance here. Because let's talk about welfare for just a moment. I'm going to get into how humiliating that is, but for now, I want to just talk about the fact that it is workers who provide in our society for those who can't or don't work. Now, not working and being able to is one thing, but not being able to work is a whole nother thing. Nobody begrudges those who cannot work or have worked their whole lives and are now retired. Nobody begrudges anybody that. But you have to remember that it's workers themselves who support welfare programs, and their rights must be taken into consideration as well. We have to be careful to keep these principles in balance. It's the people who pay for these programs, and so it should be the people who decide where they go. Now, that having been said, I have been on assistance. I have told you before that we were poor at one point, and there was actually a time we weren't actually on assistance like WIC or anything like that, but we did have, when my first son was born, he was born prematurely, and I nursed him as long as I could, and then we had to switch to formula, and the formula, he just was not able to tolerate it very well, and we ended up on a formula called Nutramigen. And it was $25 a can. And that was 22 years ago. I have no idea what it is now. But I couldn't believe it. We could not afford that formula. And so I went to our county, I don't even know where it is now, but wherever you get assistance. And I applied for assistance. And I just have to tell you, that was the most degrading, humiliating situation I have ever been in my entire life. I cannot imagine not being able to make ends meet and needing the programs, the social programs that are provided for those situations, and having to jump through the hoops that those people have to jump through every single month. Because you can't make but a certain amount of money. So you can't get a second job that would help you step up. You can't get a better car to get to your job, because that's an asset and it counts against you for receiving your assistance. I'm telling you, if you've never known this, it is a travesty what we do to people who really need the help and what we make them go through to get it. It's humiliating. It is absolutely humiliating. There has to be a better way to do this for people who really need the help and are not there to suck on the public teat. Okay? I know that's a little crass, but they're not there for that. And yet they are treated like trash. I'll just be honest. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. It's degrading the way they are treated in the process. Now, I'm not talking about the employees, because the employees I found them to be generally very kind and very compassionate. You wouldn't be in that kind of job if you didn't want to help people. Well, some people I guess do, but I didn't experience any of that. But it was the process that was so degrading, because you have to give them every single bit of your information, all your bank accounts, all of your assets, everything you have that is yours, you basically reveal to the government. And at that point, of course, they have everything. It's just a huge invasion of privacy. And I understand why they do it, because for all intents and purposes, it's to keep people from cheating the system. But the cheaters, they don't use that system anyway. I mean, I don't know what the answer is. I'm just saying, treat the people that you see in the marketplace with their debit cards that I don't even know how they do it anymore, but I know that they have debit cards and they use them to buy groceries, and maybe they have steak in their cart instead of vegetables, but don't make a comment or roll your eyes. We don't know their situations, and we have to be careful just to keep in mind that it's very humbling, very humiliating, very degrading to even be in that situation. And most people, if they could, they would not be in that situation. Nobody chooses to be poor, typically. Now, I know that there are people who are perfectly happy to take that paycheck every week and cheat the system and let somebody else support them. I had a brother-in-law that was that kind of person. He worked every single system there was, the disability, the Social Security, the welfare, you name it, he was working it. So I know that it exists, but I am saying what an embarrassing thing it is to be that person and to experience it for the first time or every month. Can you imagine that? So there's got to be a better way, I guess was my point. I'm trying to just kind of show both sides, because there are always two sides to these situations. And that's where equity really does come in. That's why it's important to think about equity rather than equality. It's not enough sometimes to make everything equal. You have to take into consideration people's situations. And of course, only God really can do that, right? And so only He can really set up a truly just society. But we're called to continue working in that direction. And so we have to keep these things in mind. So how do we do that? Well, I know that you have situations, and so do I, in our neighborhoods where we see people who are not even employable. But the best thing for them is when they can get back on their feet with the help of their church or their diocese or the other social programs that can help them find a job with meaning and with income, because it restores their dignity. The neighborhood gets better. They feel better about themselves. And then there's this harmony created that shows the dignity of work, that they experience the dignity of work, and we get to help them experience that dignity of work. There are always ways that we can do that. Another way, rather than maybe volunteering in programs. I didn't say that, but that's what I was getting at and all that. Another way that we can kind of keep it in mind is to remember the workers who are involved in producing the stuff that we consume. If you just think about one thing that you buy on a regular basis, say milk, we'll say coffee because that's a really well-known fair trade kind of commodity. So take your cup of coffee, think of the people that served it to you, think of the people who roasted those beans, think of the farmers who grew the beans. There are lots and lots of workers in that process, and our decisions impact them. Think of the sweatshops in China. I saw on Facebook in the last couple of months a video of a family that it looked like they were either in India or Indonesia, and they were making the masks that we have been using for COVID. And you should have seen the conditions, the squalid conditions, and there were very small children working on those masks, sewing, folding, stacking, you name it. And here they were putting them out by the hundreds and the thousands even. And none of us had any inkling whatsoever about the people who made those for us or anything that we wear, the things that we eat. Think about the sweatshops in China and other places. There are all kinds of really, really bad working conditions all over the world, and sometimes even in our own country. So it's important that we're informed about the issues in our society, and we need to try to promote just laws. We need to do that with our dollars, the things that we buy, and keep in mind those fair trade practices. If you're a worker, that's obvious, but if you're a business owner, it's not so much sometimes a priority to think about your workers and their dignity as workers over the bottom line. Now, I'm not saying that all business owners don't think about their workers. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that most often the almighty dollar wins out over the dignity of the worker. That's just the truth. And it's part of our Western society. It's part of our lack of consideration for human life in general. It's a lot of things. But as consumers, we can help in this area very easily. We need to be aware that every purchasing decision, it really is a moral decision. And so we have to do our best to research the things that we're buying. We can purchase ethically produced products or fair trade products. We can purchase locally, and we can buy from farmers and local shops and stores. Everybody is kind of on that bandwagon now because it's such a great idea to support local businesses, especially now in COVID when so many are shutting down. So as Catholics, we need to be aware that this is part of the way that we live our life of discipleship. Promoting human dignity, defending workers' rights, looking for ways to make our society more attentive to the needs of those who are most vulnerable. This is what we're called to do. This is the gospel. And we have to live that gospel, and the whole world is watching how we live the gospel as Americans. I'll see you next week in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I'm Sonia Corbett, your Bible Study Evangelista.
Thank you for listening to the Bible Study Evangelista Show. Find out more at BibleStudyEvangelista.com.